We shall start now. Hello, hi, namaskar, everyone. I welcome you all to the Voices from the Periphery. I am Odisha Doloy, and hereby we all sit together to enlighten ourselves today from the theme Reclaiming Myth New Perspectives in Indian Cultural Geography from none other than Professor Shonalika Kaul. Professor Kaul is India's leading cultural and intellectual historian, specializing in Sanskrit literature. She is a professor, Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and has also been the Malathi Singh Distinguished Lecturer in South Asian Malathi. Sorry, ma'am.
Indian name, Malathi.
Malathi. Malathi Singh Distinguished Lecturer in South Asian Studies at Yale University, USA. The Jan Gonda Fellow in Indology at Leiden University, the Netherlands, and visiting professor of history at Heidelberg University, Germany. She has published 9 internationally acclaimed books, including Imagining the Urban, Sanskrit and the City in Early India, The Making of Early Kashmir, Landscape and Identity in the Rajatarangini, Retelling Time, Alternative Temporalities from Pre-Modern South Asia, and Myth and Places, New Perspective in Indian Cultural Geography, and her latest, Bharata from the British and Other Essays Towards a New Indology.
She has before the British.
So sorry, ma'am.
No problem.
Bharata before the British and Other Essays Towards a New Indology. She has been invited to speak widely around the around the country and the world, including at Sorbonne, Paris, Sapienza, Rome, Stanford and Michigan, USA, Free University, if I am correct, Free University, with Waterstrand, Johannesburg, Australian National University, Canberra, University of Canton, Liverpool, the UK, the World Sanskrit Conference, Bangkok and Canberra, and the United Nations, Geneva, among other fora. Ma'am, up to now, I tell you you can start your lectures.
Sure. All right. Thank you. Namaskar, everyone, and thank you very much, Voices from the Periphery, Ayush, Pallab, all the very creative boys from and girls from the universities of Nehu, Rabindra Bharati, and FLU. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be amidst all of you today. I will be speaking about a theme today that I believe is most appropriate for the name of your group, which is Voices from the Periphery. Because I think myth has been on the periphery, at best, of the discipline of history in India, and thereby the communities and worldviews that have authored these myths have also been somewhat marginalized from historical narratives. The fascination that mythology traditionally holds for people at large in this country is often in direct contrast to the suspicion with which it is regarded by historians. Caught between a colonial high history that has disowned it and a popular fiction that has assimilated it to figment or make-believe in recent times. You know what I'm talking about. There's been a slew of mythological bestsellers and so on. Now, caught between these two extremes, myth's recovery as a historical vector and epistemic mode in its own right has been endangered. My talk today, based on my new book called Myths and Places, is a deigned response to this situation. It arises from some 2 decades of being in and thinking about the discipline of history, and also pondering over the cultural and emotional significance of places, and what Robert Goldman very poignantly called the realities of fantasy that were often more keenly felt than those of history and geography. Now, myths are effective insofar as they are affective. As Ernest Renan once said about myths on the French Revolution, And yet Indic myths have been considerably stripped bare of this content in academia to serve a philosophy of history that preferred perhaps value judgments and reduction of all cultural forms to power. Dubbed irrational, primitive, superstitious, undateable, and untrue, myth has often been discredited, either as relaying an unhistorical, obscure past of little value or relevance today. So that means if you and I are talking about myth today, we are perhaps being either credulous or we are being even cultural chauvinists. That is the kind of response that invoking myth within the mainstream of academia may typically get to. Or myth has been seen as mediating relationships of inequity, both between and within communities in history. It has tended to be seen not as the self-expression of a people, but typically as a veiled ulterior project, a result perhaps of the modern historians, and I'm quoting Richard Turdiman, perturbation at their own inheritance. I believe it is time to depart from these interpretations and rehabilitate myth. So this is going to be a pretty much conceptual and philosophical talk. So how do we rehabilitate myth? Not as history's primeval other, nor as an instrument of power and acculturation, but as communitarian mechanisms by which societies made sense of themselves and their world. So local self-understandings recoverable from mythicized narratives of landscape is the heart of this talk and indeed the book that I just showed you. Now, the Native American poet and literary critic Paula Gunn Allen once asked, quote, "Is it we who invent the stories and thus inform the land? Or is it the land that gives us the stories, thus inventing us?" Unquote. This is precisely the dialogic, disentanglable relationship that exists between myths and places, according to me. But what is myth? And perhaps that is where the rub of this whole issue lies. Myth may be broadly defined as the stories told by a specific cultural group to comprehend and articulate their experience of the world that they inhabit. From the ancient Greek word mythos, meaning story or plot, the word was originally applied, unlike how it is understood today, to narratives both sacred and profane. So myth is not necessarily only about the sacred. And to narratives both imaginary and true. They were both deemed myth in past usage in the world. So myth as primarily a story, a narrative that is told about something important. Again, contrary to the primitivist associations lent to mythology by the rationalist anxieties of modernity, historically, all cultures, not only traditional or non-literate or socially naive ones given over to superstition, not only these, but all cultures have actually given rise to myths. Myth-making was and is a crucial heuristic process of meaning-making for any society. Ironically, this would apply even to the contemporary modern era, which sports what Jason Josephson Storm has called the myth of disenchantment. What is this myth of disenchantment that we bear as inhabitants of a modern world? This is a misplaced belief that modernity has truly shed faith in magic, mystery, and wonder. So this departure of the supernatural from our lives that we are so proud about as modern inhabitants, as it were, Josephson Storm argues that this departure of the supernatural, believed to be emblematic of modernity, has also been a prominent element of secularization. which has gone hand in hand with modernization based on the Western experience of the same. So here, religion and the supernatural, and by extension myth, have been posited as opposed to reason and progress. So you see how value judgments get stacked one on top of the other against a cultural form like the myth. Back in pre-modernity, however, dealing centrally with nature and with accounts of the origins, destinies, and mysteries of humankind and the universe, myths were sometimes deeply rooted in the land and the ecology, so a very manifest materiality to their origins and their references. They could, however, also invoke supernatural forces, usually wedding the two seamlessly. Significantly, even if a culture no longer believed that its myths were literally true explanation, the stories often survived as receptacles of important cultural values. So myths were thus expressive, culturally accepted ways of knowing and being, to epistemic and ontic. Beyond the limits of verification or refutation, so that's a favorite byword for historians, isn't it? That can you verify that this happened? Perhaps beyond limits of verification or refutation, myth may often have been not about the real as true, but about the noble as true, as Paul Vane perceptively observed for the ancient Greeks. Ancient Indians even asked, what is real and true? And their answer went beyond the five senses. It went beyond the contingent to the transcendent. That is, it went beyond the empirical and the ephemeral to the ethical and the eternal. So in this way, myths were more than real. They were about that in which, socially speaking, something strong and significant was manifested. They thus epitomized cultural curiosity and virtuosity. Therefore, when you find a myth occurring in an ancient Indic narrative, this inclusion of myths there, far from being a lapse in critical judgment, actually served a crucial purpose. Its function included not only making sense of their world for a people, but enshrining and transmitting community and ultimately civilizational paragons. So a seminal aspect of identity formation for any demographic group was actually being facilitated through the medium of myth. And here myth was acting inextricably with orality and with collective memory. Those two other fields of study that till recently were again on the very much of the peripheries of history as a discipline. Now, we know that the fields of folkloristics, anthropology, and religious studies have all long invested in the study of myth as a key to understanding cultures from the inside. However, what about history? Given its ambiguous, often symbolic and subjective, rather than literal relationship with facts, myth has suffered an uncertain status in the field of history, at least the way history has been professionally practiced since the 19th century or so. Indeed, myth has perhaps always been regarded as something of an antithesis and anathema. Hence the loaded binary of historical versus mythical, right? We use this in common parlance all the time. Now, as Joseph Marley explains for the World Stage, quote, in the long history of historiography, the basic categories of both myth and history have always been defined antithetically, as if myth was all fabrication and pure fiction, and therefore a spurious description of what merely appears to have happened, whereas history was a serious and reliable explanation of what actually happened, insofar as its empirical sources and discourses were veritable, truthful. Assuming thus, I'm still quoting Mali, assuming thus, critical historians from Thucydides to Ranke, as well as all their modern followers, have commonly failed to account. So if this is what myth is all about, that it is simply an untrue figment, then why is it that these archaic modes of historical comprehension and composition have simply been failed to be accounted for by these historians? And so has been the higher metaphysical truths they served. And ultimately, why they still persist in the collective imagination and cultural traditions of all religions, nations, and civilizations. Unquote. So the point he's making is that if myth was simply this piece of nonsense, no sense, why has it been cherished the way it has across time and space? Now, no doubt, this attitude of the discipline of history to myth has had a good deal to do with the fact that Rankian or scientific historiography, as it is called, came to be a colonial project, even an agent of empire. That's how I like to call it. Insofar as it helped construct epistemologies of otherness. Thus, we are told that there were societies that possessed history and then those that had only mythology. So this is very much a part of the colonial rhetoric as it comes to establish itself in the late 18th and 19th centuries through the works of imperialist Orientalist scholars like James Mill, Harold Wilson and others. India was, in effect, developed as an excellent example of a country, a civilization that simply didn't know how to write history but had an overabundance of scripture and mythology. Now, this project of history that begins as an agent of empire has, however, outlasted empire itself by enshrining an exclusionary self-definition as hegemonic even today. One that privileges certitudes, verifiability, linearity, tyranny of the fact, of scientific method, as if humans are objects of the natural sciences, chronology, objectivity, rationality, and so on. So this modern global definition of history and its disciplinary essentialism and its methodological fetishism, as Ethan Kleinberg calls it, a methodological fetishism, delegitimized and bracketed out alternative visions and modes of representing the past that flourished in pre-modern India and indeed in large parts of the non-Western world. Myth did not just fall from grace in the process. There was a furthering of the production of the colonial other in this way, because myth also came to be exoticized as the practice of primitive people who became objects of the colonial gaze. In India, a case in point would be some of the older readings. I actually should pause and ask if the connection is still on, if I can be heard. We haven't got cut off, have we? Can someone just confirm?
It's audible, ma'am.
All right, perfect. If the link breaks, someone needs to tell me. Now, in India, a case in point of what I'm talking about would be some of the older readings of myth found in texts like the Vedas and the Puranas by Orientalists like W.J. Wilkins of the London Missionary Society. He was writing in 1882 and then in 1900. And A.B. Keith of the Asiatic Society, writing in 1916. They clearly struggled with what was for them the alien character of the Indic mythological enterprise. They couldn't understand it. They couldn't wrap their heads around it. The result? A stereotyping assessment and pejorative comparative comments, such as the following. I'll give you just a very brief quotation from both the gentlemen. Quote, "Gods and demons were very present to the minds of the Indian then as they are today." Today meaning in the early 20th century and late 19th. There exists the essential vagueness of many of the figures of Indian mythology, the mysticism of Indian conception tends over to a pantheism alien to the clear-cut creations of the Hellenic imagination. At the same time, amid much evil, there was also much good. The sages of India were not in complete darkness. Unquote. Now, this is all par for the course. We are all well aware of how Orientalism functioned. What about post-independence, though? Now, after 1947, as scientific temper and modernization became something of a patriotic duty, scholars like the Marxist mathematician historian D.D. Kosambi, writing in 1962, and the archaeologist H.D. Sankalia in 1973, creatively engaged with the question of whether myths were truly divorced from reality or somehow connected with it. Kosambi's work also explored cultural continuities from the past to the present through the medium of living myths, what he called living myths. Now, this relationship between myth and reality is in fact essentially the question that has consumed scholars of the two Indian epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, as well as the Puranas. These scholars have searched for historicity in a genre which, ironically, in its own self-understanding, had no doubts about its historical nature and function, that is, Itihasa Purana. So it is another fundamental yet moot question whether these master texts of Indic civilization, which call themselves Itihasa Purana, that is, narratives on the ancient past, whether these should be classed as mythology in the first place, is a question that needs to be raised and confronted, because it has somehow very conveniently been continued to be used for these two texts, despite some voices pointing out what the literal meaning of terms like Itihasa, which is thus it was, or Purana, which is ancient narratives, what these are. Despite that, there has been an unspoken consensus that these are not to be treated as works of history at all, at best mythology with some embedded history. However, as materialist historiography in India took over, it found itself embracing and reproducing colonial perspectives in strange ways. Thus, myth journeyed from being a victim of colonial power, as we just saw, to being regarded as an instrument of the propagation of power within Indian society itself. So power continues to define the way myth was being treated even after independence and by Indian scholars. Such a position also seemed to mirror in the 1970s the post-structuralist explication of a knowledge-power nexus. I believe this was somewhere at the heart of how Indic texts have been read then and now. Myth came to be treated by the school of thought as an agent of acculturation and hegemonization by postulated superior expanding social groups over other native groups deemed to be less advanced materially and culturally. I think you've all come across this in the textbooks you have read and so on. A powerful example of this approach is Romila Thapar's study of the Ramayana, Exile in the Kingdom, which appeared under the auspices of the Mythic Society. So, you can see the context to this, what eventually became a book but started out as a talk. Though making a case for taking seriously this deemed mythological text, Thapar argued that the men of Ayodhya and the demons of Lanka, together with the monkeys of Kishkindha, all somehow represented human social groups in conflict, namely agrarian Aryans aggressing against forest-dwelling non-Aryan tribals, respectively. Similarly, Vijay Nath argued that Sanskrit Puranas were an acculturative instrument for the imposition of what she called mainstream civilization and Brahmanization on tribal societies And why? To facilitate the spread of agriculture. Now, as Christopher Minkowski puts it, this is, quote, as if Brahmins were a species of beneficial exotic plant or insect, unquote. Apart from that, it is also worth asking how a genre like the Puranas, that was an amorphous and heterogeneous compilation of free-floating oral narratives and encyclopedic material over centuries, how these could have played such an instrumentalist role in a concerted manner all across the country. And yet this is how these texts are read even today, as some kind of orchestrated project of power and domination, be it based on ethnicity, state, or gender. However, some scholars, like the anthropologist Arjun Appadurai, have significantly called out this obsession with hierarchy in studying India, and cautioned that concepts like legitimation, acculturation, Sanskritization as the prime vehicle of acculturation have become what he calls theoretical metonyms and surrogates for Indian civilization as a whole. He says they have become gatekeeping concepts thought to apply to every socio-cultural process. Now this is worth a thought, because what this approach does is it actually limits the full potential for apprehending what was in fact very complicated compounds of local realities. And this is why, tempting though the materialist approaches to reading Indian mythology may be, they remain speculative and run the risk of force-fitting a sociological narrative on the text, rather than tapping the semantic potential of a less literal and riven reading, aligned with the text's own didactic purpose and strategies of representation instead. So, in short, what am I saying? We need to find out what the text wanted to do, rather than how we might be reading the text. How do we do that? For example, the Sanskritist Sheldon Pollock has pointed out a much needed corrective to interpretations of the Ramayana that I just mentioned, by reminding us of what the text itself may have been aiming at, namely, the pedagogical depiction of righteousness via Ayodhya and Lanka. And I believe he was also inspired by an essay by A.K. Ramanujan, a beautiful essay by him, on similarly how do we read depictions of Ayodhya and so on in the Ramayana. So he says that Ayodhya and Lanka, instead of representing humans versus demons, they actually represented perhaps two different ideals and models of emotion and behavior. So disciplined and affective in Ayodhya versus licentious and unbridled in Lanka. And further, that these then symbolized ethical choices. So the text is actually presenting ethical choices with consequences attached before one and the same society or one and the same audience, rather than portraying two antagonistic social groups in reality. In fact, it can be argued that ethics and didacticism lay at the heart of not just Indic mythology, but Indic historical visions as well, which is what I've argued in lots of other places, as well as this other recent book of mine, Bharat Before the British. So Indic historical visions actually have a deeply social pedagogy, socio-ethical pedagogy at their heart, is what I argue. And you see this not just in Itihas Puran, but also in historical texts like the Raj Tarangini. These ethics inscribed cultural truth claims. And the stories bearing and projecting these truth claims must be understood as, quote, not dogmatic, but dramatic stories of tradition, reactivating a community's original motivations. So myth as a dramatic reenactment of a community's original values, as it were. I will bring you back to all this with an example just before I finish. But similarly, let's look at a couple of other scholars. So Appadurai, Pollock, and then I already mentioned A.K. Ramanujan, but also R.P. Goldman, Robert Goldman, who I cited right at the beginning of this paper, is another one of those who has actually argued for creative ways of reading myth in connection with symbolic constructions. So at the heart of any literary reading is really first testing out whether there is a symbolic construction at work there rather than a literal one. So both of them talked about these symbolic constructions put on cities like Mathura and Ayodhya in the epics and the Puranas. And as I quoted at the beginning, the realities of fantasy that are often far more keenly felt than those of history and geography. You will note, however, that all these scholars I have named are not historians. So they actually come from other disciplines, whether it is literature or language or sociology and so on. And their interventions have remained by and large unrecognized in the historical mainstream in India, where myth has come to be considerably decontextualized in the name of being historicized, wreaking what T.S. Eliot may have called a dissociation of sensibility. When you just cut off a cultural form from the sensibility that it may have imbued and look at it and make of it things that it may not originally have been intended to. For example, it is a travesty of the obviously subaltern and complex nature of so many of the mythologies that abound in India that for many historians, myth became a top-down imposition on the people. So many of these stories are actually folk and what we might call subaltern, or talking about marginalized groups. And yet, for historians, these became a top-down imposition, that these myths were actually being composed by a certain elite strata and they were doing it for their own ulterior motives, as I mentioned. So rather than seeing these stories as an element of people's own daily lived lives and beliefs, intrinsically tied to their land and to their being, and to which beliefs different sections of a composite society could well have subscribed and contributed. Now, A.K. Ramanujan actually had sagaciously warned about this, but his warning also fell by the wayside. It has not been heeded. What did he say? He said that when it came to cultural production, the classical and the folk, the elite and the popular were points on a shifting continuum rather than mutually exclusive oppositions. But instead of paying heed to this, it is actually an imperialist prism of power and virtue signaling that has come to be deployed in the academy. So rational versus irrational. These are the terms. This is the value judgments that the Project of Empire initiated, right? There are rational societies and there are irrational, modern, traditional, progressive, backward. Now, ironically, these were reproduced within the Indian past by the academy in the form of advanced social groups versus inferior, great versus little traditions, elite versus folk, Aryan versus non-Aryan, Sanskritic versus non-Sanskritic, center versus periphery, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, taking such a critical position that I and my contributors in this book do today, amidst the deeply polarized politics of history, runs the risk of getting sucked into ideological battles, which are often themselves about power, in and through academia. But this is a risk, I think, that must be braved and defied, or we run the greater risk of not only acquiescing in the subjugation of history to politics, but losing out on endogenous, emic perspectives to recover a people's history and geography. So voices from the margins indeed. And this is why I believe that it is high time to depart from these earlier approaches and actually rehabilitate or reclaim myth, not classification, but as communitarian mechanisms by which societies made sense of themselves and their world. As Wendy Doniger put it, a myth is a story that is sacred to and shared by a group of people who find their most important meanings in it. So you take away a people's myth from them and they have lost access to their most important meanings. This is the dissociation of sensibility that I was talking about. So myth is where people find their most important meanings, an unconscious grammar of experience, if you like, which is the phrase that Ernst Cassirer uses. Those crucial issues in the history of the community, such as common ancestry, territory, fertility, morality, fraternity, heroism, in which the community believes and lives by, as it were. Thus, myths helped communities actually fashion their identities deeply and their habitat, and were fashioned by these in turn. Studying myths within the ambit of history, but in culturally sensitive ways that do not alienate myth or reduce it to something other than itself, can provide an important route to reclaim local pasts and their self-understanding. I have about another 20 minutes and I will finish well within that. Let me take this forward. Such an approach, as I am recommending, repositions not just how historians understand myth, but how they understand place. And here I am advocating for a methodological and philosophical shift away from quasi-scientificism towards hermeneutics. That is, the search for meaning and not just data, for truth claims and not just truths, for subjectivities as much as verities. Specifically, I champion the relatively recent paradigm of cultural landscape, which has so far been applied primarily in archaeology rather than in text and literature, though it is picking up now. So I use this cultural landscape paradigm to now read myth for exploring the fundamental relationship between stories, people, and places. To do this is to view the land as landscape. That is, to understand geography as overlaid by narrative and cultural constructions via myth. Let me elaborate. In a remarkably pan-Indian pattern, mythology and geography in India appear, and I'm quoting Diana Eck's very useful terminology, they appear as a joint imaginative and descriptive undertaking. What do I mean? Geographical knowledge was grounded in the mythical apprehension of the world's meaning and order. So that is why so many places like to call themselves Dev Bhumi. This is not a literal description necessarily. It is actually an allusion to the values deemed to repose in that land. So it's actually a claim, and it's a truth claim rather than a truth, you see? So you won't be able to prove it, and yet it is so crucial to those peoples, that land's identity. That is the power of myth. So geography was grounded in the mythical apprehension of the world's meaning and order, even as myth-making itself was resonant with geographical markers of the land. Together, these generated a sense of spatial identity and ownership by a community. Myths invoking natural or built features, mountains, forests, rivers, pastures, cities, villages, generated a sense of place and a rootedness in the land. As Diana Eck has beautifully shown, pan-India, but really we need so many more such works for the regions of this country. Now, these myths could be local lore, or they could be derived subcontinentally from epic and Puranic archetypes. So, mind you, myth is also a great intersection point between the universal and the local. So, providing you yet another perspective on seeing history. So, these myths could weave together gods, demigods, kings, peoples, places, as well as the past and the present. They filled out and lent tradition to the land, anchoring and orienting its people not only to their own physical world, but to the moral that inhered in these constructed and preserved memories. So, a classic teaching tool. In fact, if you look up the Platonic, if you look up Plato's exposition on mythos, it was actually considered ethics by other means, which are needed to charm one into agreement when logic fails to do so. So please bear that in mind. Ethics by other means, and this word keeps coming up again and again in pre-modernity, rather than the sacred, rather than religion. So you see, there is a much needed shift in how we have been viewing and characterizing these different periods, as it were, of the world. Now, pulling together all these different roles and functions of myth that I've been trying to detail for you, let me give you one example before I close of how prodigious myth really was in meaning making. So this example, the example is from the deemed historical text, the Raj Tarangini in Sanskrit, composed by Kalhana in 12th century Kashmir. Now, mind you, while this text has been much applauded by scholars, I think for all the wrong reasons, very empiricist, objectivist reasons, which actually did not matter to the text as much as they matter to us. But at the same time, these same historians took pains to criticize Kalhan for resorting to myth. So there are myths in the Raj Tarangini, just as there are myths, I must underline, in Herodotus's histories. And yet he is called the father of history. But our man hasn't reached that status yet. So they criticize Kalhan for his use of myth. They say he's a great historian, but he was also resorting to myth, and this was a lapse in his rationality. This is how historians have actually responded to the presence of myth in the Raj Tarangini, instead of even trying to understand what role did it play in the text. Why is this poet, who otherwise is deemed as displaying these very acute faculties of intellect, of causation, of discernment, why is he resorting to myth? Clearly because that was a well-accepted cultural phenomenon and practice. The problem is for us. The perturbation and the disturbance is for the moderns at their inheritance, to remind you of my quotation from the beginning of this talk. Now, I've written extensively about how myth actually constructs Kashmir, that actually plays such a pivotal role in the creation of a regional self-identity and selfhood. But I'm not going into all that here today. We don't have the time. It is there in my book called The Making of Early Kashmir. I invite you to read it there. But today I'm giving you only one little snippet. And this snippet relates to the centrality of the what are called Nagas to the mythology of Kashmir. Now, who are they? Sometimes deities, sometimes lords of the land, at other times serpents, or personified forces of nature, especially water bodies. So the lakes of Kashmir are actually called Naga to this very day. Javeri Naga is an outstanding example, Shesh Naga, Anant Naga, and so on. So here is continuity, cultural continuity, maintained at the ground level. Now, the Nagas occur in the Raj Tarangini as well, and they emerge clearly as a motif or a literary device. You can see that from the fact that they are fluid, they're changeable, ubiquitous, yet revered. So Nagas were classic myth builders. Stories enacted through their physical and moral agency constructed the imagined landscape of Kashmir. Now, the major example of this in the Raj Tarangini is the story of Sushtavas Naga, which is described as, see how Kalhan describes this, quote, Adyapi Katheyam Smaryate Janai. This is the story, the legend recalled by the people to this very day. Adyapi. Now, listen closely. This invocation of the present, Adyapi, to corroborate the past, and indeed as a guarantor of truth itself, should be noted. So as soon as he says that this is a story that is recalled by the people Adyapi, even today, somehow that is meant to be a guarantor of its veracity. That if they're recalling it even today, if the story has lasted so long in popular memory, that means it's true. So we have to catch these resonances about historical consciousness in the text, and we'll miss it completely if we have dismissed this myth, as most scholars have done. Now, this technique of invoking the present to corroborate the past is a recurrent feature actually in the Rajtarangani's definition of history. I've given the other examples in the book. In conjunction with the role of the people, Janai, in verily generating and preserving this proof, this formula Adyapi Katheyam Smaryate Janai weaves together the past and the present through the agency of popular memory. In the process, it conjures and attests to a collective past that is not past, but a persistent part of the present. It also points to the interpenetration of folk tale and myth. So the oral character of these tales, Jana Shruti, Katha, Varata, these are the words used, people's sayings and stories. These point to what I call the civilizational centrality of storytelling in Kashmir. And this is abundantly reflected in the Rajtarangani, which is very interesting and ironic because this text has been qualified by historians as a dynastic history, an elitist, top-down Sanskrit classic, which has nothing to do with the people of Kashmir, and clearly they were very wrong. So Janashruti, Katha and Varata are an extremely important part of Kalhan's historical vision and practice. Now, he starts like this. What is the story that Adyapi Katheyam Smaryate Janai? What is the story that the people still remember? The story goes that Sushravas's daughter, Chandralekha, married off to a Brahman, is cited and coveted by the wicked king Kinnara of Kashmir. When he attempts to have her carried away, abducted by force, the couple seeks asylum at Sushravas's abode, which is a lake. And now I'm going to quote from the text in English translation. When the facts were reported to him, the lord of the Nagas, Sushravas, blind with rage, sallied forth from the pool. Having caused a blinding darkness from fearful clouds which thundered, he burned down the king, together with his city, by a terrific shower of boulders. Thousands of human beings who had entered through terror the shrine of Chakradhar for refuge were burned down in a trice. So specificity, Chakradhar shrine, which continues to exist till today, by the way. The sister of Sushravas, the Naga lady from a cave in the Ramanya mountain, also dropped a shower of boulders on the villages. 5 yojanas of rural land were thus laid waste and is known as Ramanyadavi. So meaning, it is to even this day full of heavy boulders and holes, unquote. Even this day, Adyapi, it is full of heavy boulders and holes, unquote. The next day, however, Sushravas was full of remorse at having killed so many people. And leaving the locality, he moved to a distant mountain where he built a lake that is described as gleaming like the ocean of milk. This lake, we are told, this is Kshirosagar, right? It's an allusion to Kshirosagar, the mythical lake. This lake, we are told, quote, on their way to the pilgrimage of Amarnath, is visited by the people to this very day, unquote. So Amarnath is occurring in the 12th century text. Moreover, Sushravas' son-in-law, the Brahman, also built another lake in the locality, and Kalhan tells you this is celebrated as the lake of the son-in-law. Jamatri Sarasa. Unquote. Okay? Now, fascinatingly, not only, as we know, is this pilgrimage of the Amarnath cave a thriving popular Shaiva tradition of northern India, these two lakes referred to, also continue to exist. So you see, geographical apprehension of the geography around you through myth. They continue to exist and are the famous white-watered Sheshanag and the Zamatur Nag. So Jamatri Saras becomes Zamatur Nag, respectively. What do we get? Here is a conception of the past as being everywhere, scattered like the lakes and the boulders over multiple locales and narratives. Moreover, the interweaving of geography, myth, ritual, and folklore is brilliantly exemplified. And that's not all. It is overlaid, this geography is overlaid with a major moral lesson. And what is that? Kalhan says, through passionate lust, protectors of the land, that is Palakaha, the kings, often become destroyers of their own people. And, I'm quoting, as a result of the anger of a virtuous woman, one hears in many accounts of the upheaval of the three worlds, unquote. So this then is also what is meant to be recalled by the people and the audience of the Raj Tarangani when they see the debris of that city and the destroyed Chakradhara shrine. So here was myth in its classic role as a teaching tool. I want to quote Christopher Tilley here, who has been doing some really good work in archaeological landscapes. But look at the perceptive comment he makes about literature. He says, quote, both land and language are equally symbolic resources drawn on to foster correct social behavior and values. In narrative, geographical features of the landscape act as mnemonic pegs on which moral teachings hang, unquote. So you can see the inextricability of the interwoven nature of the narrative, of meaning, and of the land. One does not exist without the other. This narrates, this attests how physical and cultural geography, the example that I gave you from Kashmir, only one example out of the thousands we could give, attests how physical and cultural geography could be synergistically implicated also in a politico-moral critique in the process of giving expression to the history and identity of a land. Myth clearly emerges here, ladies and gentlemen, and I hope you have been able to see that, as a vector of meaning, memory, value, affect, and dramatic reenactment of a society's stories of self and self-belief. A treasure trove for the interested historian. Let me then conclude by saying that I argue for redressing the rather chauvinistic binary of history and myth that we have been running into for a long time by reapproaching history through the entry point of myth, exploring the latter as a uniquely expressive mode, as well as integrating both with geography in a fulsome way. Indeed, a sense of territorial becoming and belonging has perhaps always had less to do with objective history than with subjective traditions and associations such as myths about the land and its people that gain currency typically precisely through narrativization, textual or otherwise. Reclaiming rather than dismissing such voices from the periphery is invaluable for any society's search for itself. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your enriching lecture. Um, I now request anyone or to put forward their doubts or queries, or they can write them down. Write the questions down, and I can read it aloud.
I understand that we in our classrooms, the way we have been taught and the way we teach students even today is not heavy on rethinking our concepts, rethinking our methods, as it were. How do we even understand? Are we on the right lines when we are talking about things like givens? We treat them as givens, really. Oh, this is history. Oh, this is myth. This is the historical practice, and so on. So I can understand if this talk has been a bit of a shake-up, but perhaps that is the whole point behind these engagements, that we actually rethink and reevaluate what we've been doing as historians. Yes, do we have questions?
Yes, ma'am. We have a question from Ayush Dey. I shall read the question out. If, as Roland Barthes argues, myths function as depoliticized speech that naturalizes ideology, can post-colonial narratives ever escape the mythic structures imposed by colonial semiotics? Or does the very act of writing back contradiscourse risk becoming another mythological construct within global capitalism?
Okay, you're certainly a student of modern history. That's where all the jargon comes from. You will forgive me if I simplify your question and answer it by invoking a resort to our sources. Now, when we do modern history, our sources are already imbricated, as it were, within what you call colonial semiotics, right? Because if you're looking at the archives, for instance, from just the last 200 years or so, I'm simplifying your question here right now. There can be exceptions to what I'm saying. But when we are talking of 5,000-year-old texts, 3,000-year-old texts, 1,500-year-old texts even, we have a direct method that need not have anything to do with the colonial or the post-colonial even. In fact, I argue that post-colonialism has thought that it has to actually reinvent the wheel, whereas all it really needed to do was defer to a pre-modernity. So the pre-modern is very much missing, as it were, from post-colonial discourses. Whereas the way out, and that's my answer to your question, that how do we escape becoming this? How do we escape becoming victim, as it were, to what you call another mythological construct within global capitalism? We do that by going to our texts which long precede these phenomena, which will give you their own body of vocabulary. Why are we quoting a Roland Barthes, or why are we quoting global capitalism or post-col? Why are we not actually conversant with our... And I kept my usage of Sanskrit and so on in this lecture to an absolute minimum. But even in my classrooms in JNU, there's so much more. We are going directly to our texts and seeing what they have to say as best as we can, given our own conditioning. But I don't think the situation is as dismal as your question suggests, that this is, all gloom and doom, and this would be... And therefore, no such attempt should be made to actually reclaim our own voice. That would defeat the entire project of the Global South, for example. What is that about? Right? So that would be my response. Okay. There is another question, which is, if, as Spivak argues, the subaltern cannot speak, then who exactly? Well, you don't have to agree with Spivak, See, these are ways in which hegemonies form. Some of this is being cited as givens again, givens of historical method today. And I'm sorry to say, but they may have absolutely no relevance for the texts or traditions we are talking about. Those present challenges of their own. I'm not saying it's as easy a task as simply picking up an ancient text and you will get all your answers and they'll be neatly sterilized of any modern colonial or capitalistic interpretations. I'm not saying that. It requires a lot of work to actually be able to read traditions in their own right and on their own terms. But to me, clearly, that is the way forward, and not to be invoking my subalterns speak. The question is, are we ready to listen? problem is one of reception among modern historians rather than one of articulation by ancient subalterns or elites or whatever. Ancient Indian spatial imaginaries like Jambudvip and Aryavart were not neutral but carried embedded hierarchies. Can the act of reclaiming such mythic geographies escape the very power structures they historically reinforce? Who's asked this question? Udisha, is it you?
Ma'am, this question comes from our YouTube, the live YouTube.
Okay. I think there are problems here. Ancient Indian spatial imaginaries Jambudvip and Aryavart were not neutral but carried embedded hierarchies. What are these embedded hierarchies? I need specific textual citations. There has been enough obfuscation of this question of these terms, actually, which refer or do not refer to the extent of India as we know it today, blah, blah, blah. I have an entire book that actually talks about some of these. Where is this coming from that they actually have embedded hierarchies? We need to clarify that before I can engage with your question. That is not my reading of how some of these terminologies are used. I missed somebody's question in the middle. What are the challenges while delving into the comparison of the mythical period with the historical one? How useful are these myths in establishing chronology? Now, what do you mean by a mythical period with a historical one? So, just to take the myth we were looking at, right? It doesn't tell you when it happened necessarily, although when you read Kalhan in serial order, you can get a broad idea of what he's proposing chronologically. But, so it doesn't give you dates specifically of when this tragedy happened near Chakradhar or in Ramanyatavi. It doesn't tell you how you can prove, whether you can prove it or not. It is telling you something else. It is trying to project something else, which is the moral lesson inherent in that story, pegged on a geographical landscape. So your question needs to align itself to the nature of our source that we are studying, rather than expect to fit everything that we might ask of from other sources. It is not the job of the myth, for example, to do what maybe archaeological stratification can do or carbon dating can do. It is not the job of even a text to do that. This is where we must pay greater heed to the distinction between objectivities and subjectivities. There are entire subjectivities that also deserve to be historicized and can be accessed through these other cultural forms, and not necessarily reduce these to the questions you would ask or expect. I might add that even archaeology and carbon dating are often not able to give us the answers to these questions. They can actually take us down a very wild goose chase sometimes. This obsession with dates and with chronology, for instance. So that's my larger answer to this second question. Derrida, okay, a lot of modern history. Pallab, Derrida's difference suggests that meaning is perpetually deferred, ever reaching full presence. In post-colonial studies, thus imply that all attempts to reclaim indigenous knowledge remain. I'm sure I don't understand your question. I want to assure you that we pre-modernists are trying our best to defeat Derrida in his backyard.
Ma'am, we have one question from YouTube itself. It says, Akoham Divtyo Nasti, can mythological geography claim absolute cultural legitimacy, or must it always coexist with contested spatial narratives that challenge its singularity?
You see, where do we get this idea that there is contestation even? We get it from other narratives, right? That is the strength of the narrative. Nowhere is it being asserted that there has to be a hegemony of one narrative for it to be true. There have been multiple narratives in the past. Where there have been, we take all of them on board. But where they haven't, this question becomes a bit of a forced theoretical one, right? That what if it is being contested? We can't go anti-historical. What if? If it is, let's face it, if the text within itself is sometimes giving you evidence of that contestation, even better. And I actually argue there's a lot of complexity in Indic texts that we read, whether it is the Dharma Shastras on the one hand, the Kama Sutra on the other. And I mention this because we're currently doing this in social history in my ME class. So I say that these texts are polyphonic. So you can actually hear multiple voices speaking through these texts. So I wouldn't worry about contestation. I think it's happening all the time in early Indian society and is very much reflected in early Indian texts. And I would love for you to actually read more of my explorations about this, not just on myth, but on narrative itself, and how we can read these multiple meanings and voices in narrative. Rupali, is symbolism a great part of our so-called myths that talk to the society, are laden with wisdom for common people to understand who may not have access to education in the best way, especially for our ancients? Myth actually does not mean mythical, but a more interesting way to convey wisdom and history. Thank you, Rupali. I gather that is a comment rather than a question. I think it broadly alludes to some of the arguments I was trying to make about the functions of myth. Swati, thank you so much for being here, Swati. Glad to hear you, Shanalika. Such a brilliant eye-opening lecture. The decolonial project has been stuck in time and concepts. How far back can we go? Does my decolonial also involve recognizing someone else's? How do we repoliticize myths and other concepts without the kind of navel gazing that also defines the post-colonial or the decolonial? These are issues that you got to. So mine is a comment and deep appreciation. Swati, who better than you to actually have such a grasp on all of this terminology? I'm sure you'll be able to show me the way out. I prefer to be quite innocent of this politics, which can sometimes, as I think you're rightly capturing, as some of the boys who ask questions are also rightly confessing to. A lot of this political terminology and modern contestation can actually sometimes become real stumbling blocks. And the whole point of theory is actually to facilitate thought and not to block it. I do believe that is the original, the root meaning of the word theory is actually a problem. When you have a problem and you engage with it, rather than get into this analysis paralysis, as it were. This is coming from a pre-modernist. I think I would much rather. It's possible that that the wisdom of a lot of this jargon is escaping me here, but I would much rather. I think the fundamentally decolonial project is about actually reclaiming what you would call pre-colonial theory itself. So we are perennially relying on vocabulary and theoretical approaches and methods that are consistently modern, which unfortunately, as I've argued in my other book, Retelling Time, has also come to mean consistently very narrowly Western. Eurocentric, Anglocentric, as it were. And we can't escape that. No matter how much we have critiqued this, but we haven't been able to escape it in practice. So historical praxis, I believe, in the classroom, at least as I stand and teach or when I research and write, is very much bogged down by a very limited vocabulary. I think we need to start from scratch before I can even begin to answer such a deep question as yours. We need to come up with an entirely new discourse with its own vocabulary, its own parameters, its own emphases, because I'm hearing the same power, culture as power. I'm hearing those same words coming back to me in all the questions so far.
Oh God.
So that is a concern. Udisha, is this again from YouTube, is it? Ved philosophy, eko aham dvityo nasti. Can mythological geography claim absolute cultural legitimacy? Oh, this is a question you've already asked me.
Yes, ma'am. We see Sir Mukhya sir raising his hand.
Yes,
Sir?
please.
Hello.
Namaskar.
One comment and one question. Anyway, both of these are comments. One is that, you are, while speaking so forcefully against the treatment by historians of myth, treatment of myth by historians as the other, etc., which is a very powerful sort. You're constantly arguing. You have argued that historians have made this distinction between history and fiction and myth, treating myth as or mythology as fiction, and therefore deriding it and establishing a hierarchy, etc., etc. You are very powerfully arguing that myth is mythology is also history in a way. It should be treated as history, fair enough, But I think I thought the binary between history and mythology, which is a 19th century binary given to us, is being questioned. It started being questioned from the 20th century onwards, So it's not such a powerful binary anymore that it needs to be debunked once again in such a detail. I thought it was historians, the rationalist historians are the one who started accepting the significance of mythology for the study of history. But my second comment is, then you have constantly been using the term modern, pre-modern, ancient, etc., medieval. Medieval you haven't used, but it's the same thing, modern and so on and so forth. You're talking of the periodization of history into ancient, medieval and modern. This again is a 19th century rationalist creation.
That's right.
Entirely European creation,
Yeah.
rationalist creation. You don't see this again is being questioned very widely.
Of course.
The notion of periodization itself, not merely the notion of modern, the notion of modernity itself. All of these, and the notion of that history is divided into ancient, medieval, modern, which is, as I said, given to us by Europe in the 19th century. This is being questioned all over the world of historians, But you don't seem to have any doubt about it.
No. Sir, I'm sorry.
Quite merrily.
I'm sorry, sir. There's just so much.
Like this.
There's just so much one can cover in one talk. I have an entire book on precisely this questioning of the modern that you're talking about. As I mentioned it in my talk as well, it's called Retelling Time.
I'm sorry, but I'm talking of the notion of periodization.
I'm coming there, sir. I'm coming to the periodization. Periodization, if anyone's work has actually questioned this idea of periodization, I would like to believe it is mine, because I am someone who has stressed continuities.
It's being questioned all over
Because
the world.
I am someone who has stressed continuities, sir. Whereas historians are fetishizing change. Now, as soon as you put change as center stage, periodization is the next step. Because change is the foundation of defining how one period is different from another. So if we want to truly give up and claim that we have given up these notions of ancient, medieval and modern, though I haven't thought about whether that's a problem or not, then we need to also give up this obsession with change and actually look to a historiography of continuities. But we have problems even with that, because politics and ideology comes in even there, and we are so concerned that this will lead us down a path where we might end up talking about an India that is actually ancient. And that somehow seems to be anathema to many today. So I think there are a lot of issues involved with this. It's not as simple as, whether one accepts or denies periodization. You said that a lot of historians have accepted the significance of myth in Indian history writing, and therefore this is not a new critique. I actually named scholars who have not. And these are scholars who are defining and continue to define what we teach in class, how we actually research our texts in like the Purans or the Mahabharata and Ramayana. So I'm afraid, as a function of praxis, I do not see any change in the kind of assessment of myth that I've been detailing in this book. Otherwise, I wouldn't have written it. The significance of myth has been accepted, you said, by historians, but how is the question? What has that significance been taken to mean? If it is taken to mean that myth is simply an instrument of acculturation and power, which is what I've been detailing, then I'm afraid there are issues with it. And which is why I am then proposing a different way of actually looking at what myth is. I think there is a need to rehabilitate myths as very much grassroots expressions. And I am not aware of historical scholarship that has done that, abjuring power. Power is coming in everywhere. And I'm wondering if that isn't actually violence, epistemic violence on the texts and the traditions themselves. There is a question from Marisha. Is there a concept of myth in ancient India, an internal understanding as opposed to Itihas Puran, or equivalent terms for myth in ancient Indian languages? Yes, this is a very pertinent question. Let me cite from an actual ancient scholar that I have read, or author that I have read. So Kalhan. Now Kalhan does not say that this is a myth I'm telling you. He says this is a story I'm telling you. So Katha, Varta, Janshruti, this is how he calls it, this is how he characterizes it, right? And yet, when we make this journey from the 12th century to the 21st, in talking about what he is describing, which is, the role of supernatural entities and throwing down things from the skies and the gods coming in and founding Kashmir as a land and so on and so forth, the problem, as I said in the talk, is with us. Because we have problems in accepting these as legitimate narratives that a people could have about their origins. So we resort to the label of mythology in order to distinguish it from history. I don't believe that binary has gone at all in the praxis of ancient Indian history writing. I think that the anxieties, and for the same reasons, while we may be so, while modernity, the concept has been so debunked widely across the world, I completely agree with Professor Mukhia, but the anxieties associated with it, which relate to things like the certitudes, verifiability, linearity, facts, dating, these are all coming from there. And can anyone put their hand on their heart and claim that these do not matter to historians today? Or that these do not actually define the mainstay of the historian's project today? I don't think so. Any other questions?
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much. Sir, Professor Mukhia, thank you so much. I think we have come to the end of the session. We got many questions, but we do have time constraints along with that. Thank you so much, ma'am. With this, we come to the end of the session, today's session. I hope we have enjoyed and everyone have enjoyed today's session on reclaiming myth. And all the aspirants of knowledge today present here shall cherish each word bestowed by Professor Shonalika Kaul here. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Voices from the Periphery is a wonderful initiative, and I hope it grows from strength to strength. And thank you everyone for being here today. Namaste.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you so much.